Shabbat Shalom, great men of Yahweh. We're going to be continuing on this evening in the 16th book of Yisrayl. We're going to be in the 16th book of Yisrayl in chapter 17. So if you have your 16th book of Yisrayl, you can turn to chapter 17, which is found on page 180. And if not, you can just write that down in your notebooks. And the title of this sermon Pastor gave on May 14th, 2016, the title was Russia is Building Bombs That Can Destroy the World in Seconds, while the House of Yahweh is spreading knowledge to rebuild what they destroy. And Pastor starts off here in verse 1, Shalom everyone, praise Yahweh, are you ready? And joyful cheering and praise to Yahweh, praise Yahweh, you may be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. And then we're going to go over here to verse 3. He says, wasn't that beautiful what the Kahan brought out about the rainbow during the feast and how everything tied in to Revelations 10 verse 1? Praise Yahweh. I just brought that out last week and I've got a lot more to go on it. And just for our remembrance here, Revelations 10 verse 1 it says, and I saw another mighty Malach come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. Remember the four-color rainbow, the red, green, gold, and purple. Remember the representation of those things, and remember how it shows, the red, the sin that we came out of, and the green, the growth that we're going through, the gold, the refining, and then the purple coming forth as royal. And we see in Revelations 10 verse 1, it talks about how this mighty Malach had this rainbow, covered him. And you could see the beauty in how Yahweh has given an opportunity to each and every one of us to be able to actually go through these stages of growth so that we'd be able to come forth as Yahweh's royal sons. Now, continuing on here in the 16th book of Yisrayl, we're going to be going to page 181. We're going to skip some of those articles there that they went over. And I do encourage you men in your own time to study these sermons and these chapters in their entirety. We have certain points we're trying to cover here this evening, so we'll be kind of moving through it pretty quickly. But on page 181, in verse 14, this is reading Exodus 20, verse 3, from the book of Yahweh. It says, you shall have no hinder gods at all. They are in opposition against me. Remember, the King James had said, Exodus 20, verse 3, thou shalt not have other gods, is the way the King James was saying it, trying to make it look as if Yahweh was just another God. Now, if you jump over here to verse 16, Pastor's showing here the corrected translation, which actually gives a lot of meaning, and it goes to show the sovereignty of Father Yahweh and how He's not a God, He's not linked to the gods. He is the creator of all things, and the gods are actually those who actually at one time used to, be trained and taught, by Him, and they're the ones who turned with Satan in rebellion. So in verse 16 here, Pastor's reading Exodus 20, verse 3, the corrected translation, he says, you shall have none of all the gods, Elohim, you left behind, at all, in opposition against, in defiance of me. Okay? Now, Pastor says here in verse 17, but this, the gods, have taken a stance. They're servants of the doctors, the lawyers, and the politicians today. Everyone who is an unbeliever is in opposition to Yahweh. They are following the gods which have taken their stance. They're showing this right now, and in one of the pictures, if you notice, and just here quickly to cover, so we see here the gods have taken their stance, and they're servants of the doctors, the lawyers, and the politicians today. And you can see how society today is ruled, by these titles and these offices, through sorcery. You have the doctors who practice sorcery and trying to make it where people can sin. Maybe there's some way they can live longer. So instead of you can see the lack of education. Instead of teaching about what should be practiced, what things ought to be done, and what things should not be done. They say, oh, you got that problem? Oh, here, take this pill, or oh, we can do this operation. You know, the lawyers are kind of like doctors, except they use these laws that are made up, you know, in order to keep the people into bondage and keep them under subjection, you know, and they use these laws to actually, you know, pick and choose who can stay and who can go. And the politicians, if you've ever read much about any politician, especially like our senators, you know, almost I don't know what the percentage is, but I would say it's more than 0.75% of all the United States senators, you know, their previous profession was lawyers, you know. And so it's not just some average, you know, individual who somehow, you know, was able to get into that office. No, they were lawyers. You know, they were trained through this system, and then they were brought forth to start making up these new laws and start governing the entire country. But you can see this is how the gods have taken a stance, you know, by using their servants, the doctors, the lawyers, and the politicians today. The people are following these gods, okay, and then they're having to go to these servants of the gods to try to find, you know, peace, relief, you know, continuation, some kind of resolve or resolutions. You know, these are the things that you see today spread throughout the world. And it's not, you know, our country, you know, is only a model of what we see spread throughout the earth. You know, this has reached forward to the furthest ends of the earth, this mentality of being able to continue without education, you know, and you can see the lack of character there, because we know the first character trait in all the Peaceful Solution books, you know, the very first is to become educated. You know, you have to be educated. You have to be taught what you can or can't do. And if you're not taught those things, then you're going to do whatever seems right in your own eyes, and that's what most do, you know, and then they either get caught or they get sick or they get some kind of a curse that comes because, you know, because they were never educated and trained what they should and what they shouldn't do. Now, Pastor says here in verse 19, he says, Yahweh, on page 182 in the 16th book of Yisrayl, verse 19, he says, Yahweh made man subject to vanity. Remember what Yahweh had instructed Cain, that this desire to sin was with him, but he could overcome it. He must overcome it. You know, it was a possible thing. But Yahweh made man subject to vanity. The apostles understood that. The preachers today don't. All they can understand is what the King James Version wrote. And you can even bring them the information showing how the popes changed the King James Version before it ever came to you. They changed it. They made renditions of the book of Yahweh. In those renditions, they wouldn't allow certain things to be shown. They even left out scriptures, and they say the reason they left them out, in their own words, that paragraph was problematic. You know, they left out words because that paragraph was problematic. It's going to cause us trouble. Somebody was going to see there were a bunch of liars sitting up there in that city called the divining serpent. You know, and I want to, if you turn over in your book of Yahweh or write it down for your notes in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 on page 524 of your book of Yahweh, because remember what Pastor said here in the beginning of verse 19, Yahweh made man subject to vanity. You know, let's go look at the words of the wisest man who ever walked the face of the earth. You know, King Solomon, who actually begged Yahweh for that wisdom, and Yahweh granted it to him, and he actually had that knowledge and that understanding. And let's look at what he said about this vanity. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, it says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. You know, and you might be thinking, well, I'm not young. You know, I'm 10 or 15 or 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. You know, we're still pretty young, man. If you just think about the age of the earth, you know, 6,000 years, you know, no matter if you're, you know, 10 to 80 or 1 to 100, you know, that's still just a small percentage of just the age of just mankind being placed on the earth. We know the earth, you know, was here and created before mankind was placed on the earth, because the gods came and they defiled the earth, and Yahweh had to clean it up so that mankind could be placed on there. But, you know, just in the time period from Abel, the first righteous priest Abel, down to us, 6,000 years, you know, we're still in our youth, you know, and that should make us feel great in the morning and be like, yeah, I'm still young, I'm strong, go there, run a race. You know, you saw Pastor running the race there with the young men. You know, we can still bust out some energy. But the great King Solomon here, he was saying, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years draw near when you say, I find no pleasure in them. Before the sun or the light or the moon or the stars become darkened, and the clouds do not return after the last rain. We know that this destruction is going to bring about these things of the darkening of the sun and the moon, and actually these dark clouds that Yeshua is going to have to roll back. He's going to have to roll back, or all hope of life will be lost. Skip down over here to Ecclesiastes 12, verse 6. It says, remember your Creator before the silver cord is cut. We have a mighty yawesome opportunity, to be able to understand the words of life coming forth from Yahweh's house in these last days, because that's a very small percentage of the earth's population that has this opportunity. Many see problems, but they still run to their churches for answers because of the deception, and because that veil of deception that's still covering their eyes and their faces. And you see this in the news when these man-made disasters take place. I know, I believe it was like 2 or 3 years ago, there was a bad earthquake in Southeast Asia, and it was showing how everybody was running to their churches, and actually a large group of people died because that church actually, from the earthquake, that church actually collapsed. But people, when they get in a little bit of a pickle, and they can't stand straight on the earth because the ground's shaking tremendously, like you were driving down the road on the backhoe or something, they get scared. And what do? They've been taught that, well, the Lord's going to save them, so they're going up there ready to get raptured up. They want to get sucked up to heaven because they don't want to be, getting caught up underneath this rubble. And you see this in all different sorts of actions. I think it was on some of the videos they had put on the news in the shooting in Las Vegas. You hear everyone screaming for their gods, and oh God, know this, and they're when they get into a situation to where there's a blocking between them and their choice to do whatever they desire to do, then they run to their gods because this they've been educated. But we have to remember, Yahweh's given us this knowledge and this understanding, and this silver cord is our connection between us and Yahweh. And when that's cut, we just be out there looking for 99-cent burger and some bacon on top, and trying to run to the country concert down there in Las Vegas or wherever we'd be going, and we'd be getting caught up in this mess. And you're going to see, what we've seen up to this point, we haven't really seen nothing, man. We haven't seen nothing of the destruction that's coming. The most you can think about with people dying in one instant would be when they used the 2 nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one in each city, where hundreds of thousands of people instantly died. That's the most that we can see throughout history, but we're actually going to see millions of people, billions of people destroyed, and then those who are left alive after these things, they can't even, most societies today can't even function without electricity. They were talking about that article Pastor read last week about how North Korea knows that if they strike the U.S. with a electromagnetic pulse bomb, they'll just wipe off the grid, and it could kill out millions of people just not having electricity. And sometimes we don't totally notice it gets cold here, but not super cold. But if you're living like up north and you're relying on electricity for your heat, and you're relying on it to be able to produce your oil, your cooking oil, or your heating oil and such, and those things get shut down, you can see how quick life can come to a halt. And this is what the King Solomon. This is what King Solomon wrote about. About how vanity, vanity will distract us from remembering our Creator. Continuing on here in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 6, he says, "Remember your Creator before the silver cord is cut, before the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher shatters at the fountain." And then in verse 7, he says, "And the dust returns to the earth it came from, and the spirit returns to Yahweh who gave it." And then in verse 8, you see, he says, "Vanity of vanities, says Koheleth, all is vanity, emptiness, and utter futility." Okay, so you can see you can see Yahweh made us subject to vanity, but as he told Cain that we must overcome this desire to go our own way, and we must choose righteousness in order to be able to help bring forth righteous fruits. Remember, Matthew chapter 7 talks about a tree that does not bring forth righteous fruits will be cut down and cast into the fire. If we're not bringing forth righteous fruits, and we might be mindful that everything that goes into our mind right now is going into our DNA. And everything that's going into our DNA is going to go into our children, whether we have them this year, next year, 10 years, 100 years. Those things are carried down. As we see things that we suffer, were carried down from our fathers or our forefathers or our great forefathers. We see these things carried down. Everything that we put into our mind, goes into our DNA and that comes out into our children. And this is why we see, just as it says in Yeketsky, that we would see the peak of sins reach its peak, come to a fullness, because we see what occurs when you remove righteousness, you remove the righteous teacher, you take away the understanding of life, the Holy Scriptures, you take those things away and you see what it actually comes to, where, even those who have confused minds say, we got some serious issues, we're not going to be able to continue going on in this way, we're going to be extinct before we get, another 20 or 30 years, and it's amazing how the things mankind puts so much trust into their gods, that the things that we see every day on the news, that pastor's been teaching for 40, 50 years here in the wilderness, the things that we see on the news, and we see the prophecies coming to a head, and we see this 4/5 of the earth about to be wiped off of this planet. Mankind, they put their trust in their gods and their politicians. What do we read there? About their servants, of the doctors, the lawyers, and the politicians. And they really go about day to day, the majority of mankind today, just thinking everything's going to work itself out. They're so used to having war, because, well, how long have they been having it? All the way since Cain, right? They're so used to having war that it's just a normal thing, They're going to kill these people, and they'll kill those people, and they'll fix this, and they'll fix that. We might lose a couple hundred here, a couple thousand there. What do they always say about, instead of showing how stupid war is, they always say, well, you got to sacrifice. Our country was built on the sacrifice of the bloods of our patriots. They build this up. They make these people who have been misled and confusion. They make them into more gods. That they also go and then they worship. And praise Yahweh, men, that Yahweh's removed this veil of deception. That we're here at His house being taught righteousness. Because if not, we might be finding ourselves out in those horrible situations. Now in Ecclesiastes 12 verse 7, where it talks about "and the dust returns to the earth," it kind of reminded me of what Pastor, if you turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 3 on page 523 verse 20, what he had talked about, or I'm sorry, it was one of the great priests 2 weeks ago had talked about, if we don't choose to partake in righteousness, then we're going back to dust. Yahweh is not going to allow us to continue. We'll bring ourselves back to the dust. And this is what King Solomon says here in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 20. It says, "All are going to the same place. All are from the dust and will return to dust. Who can know," or in verse 22, "So I understand there is nothing better than for a man to rejoice in his own works, because that is his reward. Who can bring him to see what will be after him?" We have to rejoice in our works. Our works, men, really, it's not about us. Our work, we've been called out to be servants to all creation. Remember, Romans says, all creation earnestly awaits the revealing of the sons of Yahweh. All creation is waiting for us to be able to lead and guide them in righteousness. So we are rejoicing in our own works, and our own works being Yahweh's work, and that's what should bring us our joy. That's where we have to find our joy. If not, we'll fall into what? Vanity, because Yahweh made us subject to vanity. All right, and if we don't choose righteousness, it's the only other option. There's no in between. There's no, side roads, back roads. Short ladder over here, grab a rope over there. You're either following Yahweh's instructions, and you're on that straight and narrow road towards His kingdom and bringing forth perfect peace, or running back to vanities, And let's try to be really keeping that at the forefront of our minds, so that we can find joy in our works, because our works are Yahweh's works, and we should have this burning desire we see in Pastor that he's had for many years, this burning desire to continue to bring forth life, to be able to bring forth life and life more abundantly, to be able to actually bring forth righteous fruits, because we know righteousness spreads, it spreads quickly, but you have to have teachers who can stand for righteousness, strict teachers of righteousness. Now, if you jump over here to page 183 and verse 28, page 183 and verse 28, back in our 16th book of Yisrayl, Pastor says, what's the strongest thing you could do? The strongest thing you've got, the strongest strength you've got is Yahweh's laws. Yahweh's laws, they change the heart and the mind. Force does not change. It only makes you hate more. This is why when we come to the knowledge of understanding, we have to be able to long after and lust after and seek after righteousness, and learning Yahweh's laws and diligently searching for these things, because if not, we're basically giving ourselves over to, well, I'm just doing this because I have to do it. Remember the difference between righteousness and holiness. Righteousness is keeping Yahweh's laws. Read in Zechariah chapter 14 and Isaiah chapter 66. All flesh will go up to the house of Yahweh from feast to feast and keep Yahweh's laws. Right? Because there's not going to be any other choice. Everyone's going to do it. But we are to be the holiest of the holies. We should long after, lust after, love the keeping of Yahweh's laws. Not just do it because, well, that's what we got to do because I don't want to get burnt in a nuclear bomb. No, we have to long after these things and search after them like you would like a really great meal or a dessert or whatever cooks your fancy. If we want to be a part of Yahweh's plan forever, we've got to qualify for what Yahweh's brought us here for, man. There's a reason there's only a small number of people that Yahweh's called out, because He's given positions of leadership to those who will qualify. And how do we qualify? We qualify by, what did Pastor say a couple weeks about getting the leavening out? Get rid of disobedience. We qualify by being obedient to what Yahweh's instructing us here at His house. So that's our strength. That's our strongest strength that we have as Yahweh's laws. They change the heart and the mind. And being obedient to the instructions Yahweh is giving us through His house, you won't see it instantaneously. Maybe some people will, but for the majority, it's not an instantaneous thing. But over time, you actually start feeling your own mind and your own heart to being changed. You won't just wake up the day after you get baptized and whoa, man, I'm changed. I'm great. I'm ready to go now. Righteousness, Satan, get away from me. Get behind me, Satan. No, right? Conversion is a lifetime process. If you continue to practice righteousness and you continue to build your mind through the studying of the laws of Yahweh, the Holy Scriptures, the books of Yisrayl, the teachings that are coming forth from the house of Yahweh, you actually, over time, will start to see your heart and mind changing. Because we know our thoughts, we know our thoughts, we know what goes through our mind, we know the things that pop into our mind, but over time, continue to stay steadfast and persistent. We'll start actually seeing the change in our own life, because that is our strength. Yahweh's laws are our strength, and that is what changes our hearts and our minds. If you go over here to page 184 on verse 20, page 184 on verse 43, and closing here, and just quickly here, I wanted to cover quickly, because remember the title of this sermon was Russia is Building Bombs That Can Destroy the World in Seconds, while the house of Yahweh is spreading knowledge to rebuild what they destroy. And in verses 29 and 30, Pastor was reading this article about this Russian bomb that had come out here last year that they were advertising and promoting. Because remember what's been taking place here. We see the Catholic Church is pushing those who don't bow a knee to Mary, just like Malachi Martin said many, many years ago in the book The Keys of This Blood. They're pushing they're pushing this forceful system upon those who have kept their money from the pockets of the Vatican. And this is why we see such a divide amongst nations today. The propaganda, they drink vodka all the time and, chop off an American's head and use it as a ice puck or something. The propaganda, they'll paint their enemies as being these real evil, nasty savages. Remember how the Native Americans were painted in history? But here, look, in verse 29, the RS-28 Sarmat missile, this is the bomb that Russia's created. It's called the RS-28 Sarmat. And they dub it, so it's also known as Satan 2, because they already had a Satan 1, but it wasn't destructive enough. Satan 1 was just a little too weak. It was just a little devil. They needed a bigger devil. All right, so they got the Satan 2, the RS-28 Satan 2. Pastor says it's named after the serpent, that old serpent called the devil and Satan that deceives the whole world. They named it Satan 2, and it will replace the SS-18, which was known as the Satan 1. Now look at this. This missile is capable of flying at a speed of 4.3 miles per second. 4.3 miles per second. And so from where we're sitting now to Russia is 5,926 miles. Okay, we're 5,926 miles away. If you were to fly there, it would take, 13 to 16 hours on an airplane. But this missile, if it were shot right now from Russia, it'd be here in 23 minutes. Before class is even over, kaboom. So you can see how quick, and this is what Pastor says here in verse 43, you can see how quick destruction can come upon man. And you can see, men, that without Yahweh, we'd have no protection. I love what Pastor said last week about where would you run to? You run to your hole in the ground, or, you got your ship, someone steals it, your hole fills up with water. You can't run from these things. You either have Yahweh as your protection, or you're lost, you're doomed. In verse 43, it says, Texas is a big place that could be destroyed with one bomb. Now that's what they've come to. The greatest minds in the world have brought themselves to this point. Okay, we see this. The greatest minds, the most intellect, 100 years of 6,000 years, where they've had the smartest things, the greatest technology, this knowledge increased. And what have they brought? The point where Texas could be destroyed using one bomb. And that Satan 2, if you read about it, that Satan 2 can actually hold 10 warheads. So they could destroy Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana all at once with one missile. With that, men, I'm out of time. If you all please stand. May Yahweh bless your Sabbath. May Yahweh continue to bless your understanding. At this time, I have the great opportunity to turn over to a great priest in Yahweh's house, the great Khan, Michael Hawkins.
Please be seated, men. Praise Yahweh. You can see that the world is really going crazy, To think about the minds of the men to develop a weapon that could do something like that, And like the chapter says, Russia's building bombs that can destroy the world in seconds, Just a few of those, Well, actually, one of those with the 10 warheads would wipe out the United States, But like it says, while the House of Yahweh is spreading the knowledge to rebuild what they destroy. Okay, so that's what we're striving to do. That's why we're going to school and we're schooling ourselves, right, in the laws of Yahweh and the peaceful solution, so we can get these things ready in our hearts and our minds, so we can be ready to be able to rebuild. Because remember, this is what Yahweh has made us for. Okay, He made man to replenish the earth. Now, it's all in His plan that it has to get to that point to where it's going to be, destroyed. But the outlook is really great as far as when you look at Yahweh's kingdom and you understand those things. Look at verse 47 here, because verse 46 talks about how Yahweh says, I haven't sent these prophets. And, of course, this is the reason why the world's in the shape it's in, because there are no prophets. There's no one to actually guide and lead the people, the leaders and so forth. So they don't know what to do. So we see here in verse 47, it says, this priest is the one that led the world into a flood. Okay? And Yahweh said, now you've killed Abel. Of course, he's talking about Cain there in verse 46. And he says, now that you've killed Abel, he says, and his blood is now crying out. He says, now you're cursed from the earth. And he says, you're actually cursed from the earth. It wasn't Yahweh, of course, sending this curse, but it was the microorganisms of which the earth is made up, and your body is made up of these things. And so, if the earth is cursed, then, of course, our bodies will be cursed because we're made of the same things, And so it's going to enter into us through the earth, through the land that we walk on, through the air that we breathe, through the water that we drink, and so forth. All of these things, when it rains and so forth, all these defilements are coming upon us all over the earth. And it's only the keeping of Yahweh's laws, as the great Kahan just said, that's what's going to keep us alive, and that's what actually protects us during this time period right now. Well, let's see, verse 48. It says, I think we're so blessed to have probably, the greatest microorganism teachers in the world. And if you jump down to the bottom there, that same paragraph, it says, they don't really take it. Oh, he's talking about this scripture here about the microorganisms. And he says they don't really take vengeance. It's not like the microorganisms are taking vengeance, but they're losing their power and ability when you sin and through the blood that's shed. Okay? And so this is what he was telling Cain, that look, you've cursed yourself from the ground because the microorganisms now will no longer have the ability to continue keeping you alive, future generations, because you've cursed yourself by this thing that you have done. Remember now, the law, he's talking about the bloodshed and the wars and the violence and all these things, because remember that was the mark of Cain. All these things would take place. Well, the law of Yahweh says when you kill an animal, for the purpose of eating it, you are to pour the blood upon the ground and to cover it with the ground. So the microorganisms are made to where when the blood is covered in the earth, the microorganisms that are in there can take it and tear it down to a usable substance to where it can actually be beneficial to the ground. But of course with war, dead bodies lay out all over the ground. And not only just war, but just think about the mass shootings. Just think about the killings. A gang or somebody shoots somebody in the street, and the person dies. Well, the blood goes all over the street. Well, people probably think, they just wash it off and so forth, and that's it. But where does it go when they wash it off? It ends up going back into the water supply of these cities. And the people drink this stuff, and they don't even realize the things that's going on. And this is what Yahweh said in his law, do not eat blood, because of the confusion that it causes to the mind. And that's one of the things that he talks about here. So Abel's blood, remember in Genesis 9, Yahweh also said, when he told Noah, he said that at the killing of every animal, the shedding of blood and the killing of every animal, there will be an accounting for it. So it has to be in the accounting when that blood is shed, because it indicates who killed it, why they killed it, what they ate. If they ate the blood, that's going to be recorded in the heavens. All these things are recorded in the heavens. Every time we do something with Yahweh's creation, there's an accounting for these things. And man has been made to take care of the earth, to be the caregiver, to rule over all of these things, and to make sure that all these things are taken care of. So if we misuse and abuse that role that we have and the office that we have in that sense, then of course we're going to be held accountable for that. And of course we are the ones who are making the earth groan whenever we sin like that. So in verse 49 it says, in Genesis 6 it shows that the violence was had taken over the earth, when the earth was populated. It says it was populated big time at that time. Men lived old ages, and so did the women. They had children pretty close together. They were strong. They were healthy. They lived like 900 to 1,100 years instead of dying at 60 or 34 years old like they're dying now. The earth was very populated at that time, and it was overcrowded. It overcrowded the microorganisms. It overpopulated the already crippled microorganisms that govern the rainfall. The microorganisms cannot govern themselves. Notice. They cannot govern themselves. And even in the Psalms 150, verse 1, it says, let everything that has breath praise Yahweh. In the King James, it says, praise him in the firmament of his power. And so it shows that the microorganisms themselves praise Yahweh because they serve Yahweh, but they can't govern themselves. Everything is governing. Governing means there's laws, okay? And there's laws that the microorganisms themselves must follow. And so there are laws that govern everything that exists in Yahweh's creation to keep it together. This is why a rock remains as a rock and a leaf remains as a leaf. You won't see rocks growing on trees. You don't see leaves growing on rocks. These are laws that stipulate that everything must remain in the way that it was originally created. And nothing can change that. But mankind wants to change those things, you see. He wants to go in there and change stuff because he doesn't like the way it is, or he thinks he's got a better idea how to make something better. Okay, so these microorganisms can't govern themselves. They're what govern your raindrops, in fact, and how many raindrops fall at a certain time. And we're seeing some of this now. We had a flood. This is when we had that bad weather storms and stuff like that. But he says we could have a flood, and it could get out of control, except Yahweh assists the microorganisms. He makes sure that he stays in control, that he won't let it go too far, but he's letting it go far enough so that we can see the results of it. And you can see this when these hurricanes come through and so forth and the flooding that takes place. But he said you're going to see this. He says he wants you to see it. He wants you to see that you could actually cause another flood. Okay? The flood of Noah is what he's talking about. That was a reason for that flood, and there was a reason why that flood came about. It wasn't just because Yahweh got upset and mad at mankind and said, what the hell did I make here, and destroyed them all. That's the way the Christian minds think, that God got angry and he destroyed all of his creation. But that's not what Yahweh did. Okay, there was a reason that these things took place. So in verse 51, he says, he's talking about the rainbow, and he says that Yahweh won't allow that to take place again. But there's a rainbow that he set up as a reminder, and he's also sending one in these last days as a reminder to teach us these things. And of course, Revelations 10:1 talks about that the one sent in the rainbow. And in verse 52, he says, well, you can see that from what occurred there, it would, if you just study this, he says it wasn't Yahweh causing this. It wasn't Yahweh that caused this flood, but that's the way that they render it. But these were the gods that were leading the people to be evil like the gods. Remember, that was the teaching in the beginning in the garden. Be evil like the gods. But when they overpopulated the earth with microorganisms that were sick, they couldn't handle their jobs. They were sickening them, not only with the blood, but illegal sexual activities as well. There's nothing new under the sun. So all of these sins were there. Okay, and Leviticus tells you that. When it says about how that all the nations before you had committed all these sins, and that the earth will vomit you out. Well, these are the same things as poisoning the earth today in our atmosphere. And these things cause the microorganisms in heaven that govern how much rain falls on the earth to become sick. And the former and the latter rains that govern them. Okay, the former and the latter rains. Eob 37:13 says he brings the clouds to discipline man. Or he also brings the clouds for mercy to water the earth and to show it loving kindness. So there's benefits when it rains. When we receive the former and the latter rains like this, it's great for the crops and stuff, but you get too much rain, of course you flood out your crops and you lose it all. And same thing if you don't get enough rain, it's not going to grow, So sometimes these things are set upon the earth just to govern certain things, to bring about Yahweh's plan, such as the drought. So the waters that were above the earth came down, okay, because there was nothing to stop them. There was no law, notice. It says there was nothing to tell or to govern it to keep them from falling. You reject the laws of Yahweh, and of course the curse has come. And this is exactly what the people did. They pushed the laws of Yahweh aside, and the sins of the people rose up into the heavens, the same as it's doing today. You know, Revelations tells us that. Revelations 18:5 says the same thing. In fact, the King James Version says, for her sins have reached into heaven. And the Concordant Version says, for her sins were piled up to heaven. And the Companion Bible says, for her sins built together up to heaven. You know, so this Greek word reached, it means to reach so far as to come in close contact and to cleave and together. Okay, and that's exactly what you see taking place. Because of the sins, these microorganisms go in and they cleave to other ones, and they infect other ones, and then they infect others, and more and more and more. So the microorganisms that are defiled from the defilement of sin is attacking the other ones and affecting the other ones, and actually affecting the health of the ones that are still trying to do their job. And this is why we still have rainfall, you know, because that's a law of Yahweh, that these microorganisms are governed to do this, but they're still having a hard time. And this is why sometimes too much rain may fall in certain places. So, he says, the waters came down in abundance until they destroyed what was destroying the firmament, the microorganisms in the firmament. Okay, so this is what he allowed the flood to take place. Look over to verse 54, next page here. He says here, it talks about sodomy, and he says sodomy is destroying the earth. Of course, this is destruction because it's a part of the destruction of the microorganisms that make up our bodies. You know, we're from the dust of the earth. The same microbes that are in the earth, in the ground, is in our bodies. We're made of the same substance. So when you poison the body and the body dies or is shedding this poison while it's still living, of course, that cripples the microorganisms. And that's what you see here. That's the reason why Satan pushed so hard about sodomy and all of these sexual sins, because it actually cripples the microorganisms and brings about sickness. Now, Yahweh said in Jeremiah 23, verse 14, he says, I've seen in the prophets of Jerusalem a horrible thing. A horrible thing. Even in my own house I have seen this, notice. So even the priests, some of the priests in the house of Yahweh had actually fallen for this and had actually turned into Satan's following Satan's way. And of course, you see, this is how that eventually what took place. Solomon, of course, remember Solomon already... They already had women in there who pretended to be righteous, who had power over them by Solomon. Solomon put women in certain places and so forth. And you find that in the scriptures anyway. You know, there's always in the scriptures, in the temple area and so forth, they, you know, even at the tent of meeting and stuff, the women had their offices. The women had their certain positions that they kept serving at the house of Yahweh in those areas. And Solomon also had set people up. And so when he died, of course, when they wanted to take over the temple, that's exactly what they did. They already had the women set up, so they used those women to go ahead and fulfill the parts of doing this. Now, of course, this was, you can read about this in 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 10. These are the foreign wives, the foreign women that Solomon married. And, of course, when he did that, that was his downfall. He no longer served what Yahweh says, don't go out and take these women as wives, because they're going to bring you down and destroy you, destroy your faith. But of course he didn't listen. He did that and he began to weaken, and this was the downfall of Solomon when he did that. And of course at the end of Ecclesiastes, you see all through the Ecclesiastes, he tells you all the things that he learned through all of this hardship that he had to go through, you know. And realize at the end, as he said, the best thing is just serve Yahweh. Okay, that's the whole duty of man. So in verse 57, he says here in Jeremiah 24:14, I've also seen the prophets of Jerusalem a horrible thing. They commit adultery, they walk in lies, they turn from Yahweh and they follow after the gods. They also strengthen the hands of evildoers so that no one turns back from his wickedness. Okay, and that's the same thing that Yeshua said. Remember, he says, you shut off the kingdom of Yahweh, and you take away the keys of the kingdom, and those who would try to enter into it, you make them twofold the sons of hell than yourself, right? So you can see that this continued on, and Yeshua had to battle with that as well. Now, Revelation says it's a time where he will destroy those who destroy the earth. Well, that's not what he's going to do. He's going to allow mankind to bring this about so that they can learn the lesson, that this is what takes place when you don't keep his laws. Very simple. But yet, man's got to learn the hard way. And in verse 59, it says, all of them are like Sodom to me, and her inhabitants are like Gomorrah. And we certainly see that today. This is the wickedness that they have, They're like Sodom and Gomorrah. Therefore, this is what Yahweh our Father says concerning these prophets. Behold, they will be fed with wormwood, and they will be made to drink the water of gall. Now, this water of gall, okay, this, if you look it up, this is actually the juice of the poppy, okay? This is opioids, okay? This is the drug industry. This is the pharmaceutical industry, okay? It's the same thing that they had back then. They were using drugs. Babylon, you remember, had the oldest catalog of drugs to begin with. So this is nothing new that went on here, but it plainly shows you that even in today's world, who is responsible for the drug industry? It's the Vatican. So these same prophets do this, and they profane. From the prophets of Jerusalem, profaneness is going out to all the world. Remember, Yahweh took over and spread out to all the world and took all of this abomination into the world. And that's exactly what we see going on today. Jump over to verse 69 here. He's talking about an article here, and he says, they live in our guts and digest our food. They actually digest our food. They live in our stomach, our brains, everywhere. Okay? So this is the microorganisms that he's talking about. Some live in our guts. Now you can see Satan's attack on the food supply with the GMOs, to try and destroy mankind. But they live in our stomach and our brains and everywhere. They digest our food. Now notice our brains, okay? Well, this is where the confusion can come in. Now, if you break these laws and these microorganisms start working, if they each enter the brain, this is when it causes the confusion and people can't think straight. Some of them make us to love chocolate. He says they may even control your moods, okay? And they help turn weeds into fuel and gobble up oil spills. Now, this is what these microorganisms are capable of doing, okay? You can take weeds, certain grasses and stuff, and they can distill them and so forth and put them through the process and actually come out where it ends up actually adding, then they can add these certain microbes to it, to the brew, and then it actually makes it into a fuel that you can burn in engines. And then, of course, they also have some that you can gobble up oil spills. So when they have these oil spills out on the ocean, they can use these things. The only thing is, I think the real danger of these things of letting the stuff loose. It might eat up all the oil, but when it's finished up the oil, what else is it going to go after next? Is it going to go after the marine life to get the oil out of the fish and so forth? You just don't know. But when you have control over these things, then you won't have to worry about it. You'll be able to clean up the earth. We'll be able to get rid of all the radioactive material because there are microorganisms now that love radioactivity, and we can let them loose, but we'll have control over them to control what goes on in the cleaning up process. Right now, mankind doesn't have any control. They can experiment with certain things, but they don't have any control over it, and this is how it can get out of hand and actually do more harm. He says, anyone who watched The Martian, that was a movie, I think, it learned that crops cannot grow without associated organisms in the soil. And he said, I made a statement 40-something years ago in Abilene about the future farmers of America. He says, if they had worked with the microorganisms to improve their health, it would have changed the world. It would have. But the thing is that it's not, the world doesn't want to change. They're not interested in changing. Not unless it makes them money. Then they would look into something. But he says, what we're seeing is this function from these tiny creatures that you can't see, but they fill your mouth, your lungs, your brain, your guts, and everything. You're made up of these creatures, these small creatures. We poison them We poison them, and Yahweh shows us how we poison them by eating unclean food, mixing that unclean food with the bodies of people, and creating a mutation of organisms that can't do the work, but they make war against the ones that can do the work. He says, now that, in a nutshell, is what's going on. So, if man is made from the dust of the earth, which the microbes, so then if the earth is defiled, then those same types of microbes that defile the earth can defile the human body as well, because we are made of the same stuff. Now, these microorganisms are working for our benefit, of course, and Yahweh's house has learned how to use them and how to get the soil working properly and getting ideal soil. In verse 73, he says, I don't know if the average person out there could. He says, I met one in Odessa who, when I was working with Jacob, and he was going to teach the people in the desert how to grow a crop. He said, well, I went out and I looked at his field and I saw that the man really didn't know anything about making crops grow anywhere, much less the desert. But he found out the hard way, and he quit after a short time, which I think most of these people are going to do, trying to come out of the system and grow their own. He says it's a hard job, and if you don't work with the microorganisms all the way, then your cows start breaking down, your soil breaks down, and you get poison in your food by way of the dysfunctional microorganisms. You get that poison in your body, in your brain, and in your guts. And that's when it starts breaking down the organs of your body. So notice, you get in your guts, you get in your brain. Well, remember, Yahweh's law is written in our hearts and our mind. So Yahweh's laws are written to protect us from these things. So if we keep the laws of Yahweh and we have them written in our hearts and our minds, then we will have the protection that Yahweh offers mankind. Okay? Because as long as you're keeping Yahweh's laws, you're protected by Yahweh. Now, the White House wants to encourage research into the microbiome. The microbes, which is the microbes living in and on all animals, the dirt, the oceans, the atmosphere, and everywhere. It's the system of microbes. We'll read something a little bit later to bring all this together. But he says, so they know. They didn't know a few years ago, but we told them. We told them what to look for. We told them about the bacteria that there was, how they're poisoning the microorganisms that make up the rain. So they're spending a lot of money on research that they found out. And actually when they do this, they prove the Bible to be true, the scriptures to be true. But they know, now they know what to do, but their knowledge is limited. They really don't have the full knowledge and understanding, not like the House of Yahweh does. So they know more, but they really don't know how to bring all this back into health. This article says, we really don't have a definition of what is healthy, and that's what we need. They don't know what is healthy right now. The world doesn't, because Yahweh showed you this, and the great wisdom of Yahweh is tops. It can't be beat. You just have to believe that, right? You have to believe that Yahweh is true, that Yahweh is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, as Hebrews 11 says. I believe it's 11. But he says, we really don't have a definition of what healthy is, and that's what we need. Joe Handelsman of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy said in an opening to White House event introducing the initiative Friday, we want to fix dysfunctional microbiomes or protect microbiomes, Handelman said. We just don't have the tools to do that. Well, of course, the first thing is you've got to stop doing wrong. You got to stop committing sin and keep the laws of Yahweh, and then you can start doing these things. Repent and convert, because Yahweh's health laws will also, bring health to people and to the land and so forth. You see, Yahweh's health laws, we always think about, you don't eat pork. Okay, well, that's not all the health laws. The health laws themselves deals with the sabbatical year. Okay? Unless you take care of the earth and take care of those microbes and allow those microbes to rest and allow those microbes to do their job throughout that year so they can have that sabbatical year to completely rebuild the soil, you're not going to have health. You just go back in there, and about all the farmers can do is they think rotational crops, rotate the crops, and that's going to take care of it. That's not going to take care of it. You replenish a little bit of stuff back into it, soil, but you're not allowing the microbes themselves to keep the laws of Yahweh, which they're governing they're governed by the laws of Yahweh in order to keep the soil healthy for us. So this is all part of the health laws of Yahweh that people just overlook and have no idea about what goes on with Yahweh's laws. So he says you got to stop sinning. Okay, verse 82 says, so they're putting billions of dollars into these things to try to understand about the microorganisms. Okay? And then he goes on, remember he talks about the dogs, how all the dogs came from one breed and so forth. All the animals come from one breed, from one stock there. And if you just allow all this to get back to the original, you would find the original dogs. You would find everything would be original. So any breed of stock would go back to the original after a while. And the microorganisms would do the same. The microorganisms could actually straighten themselves out and get rid of all the toxins, all of the sickness that's affecting them, and they could get back to their original state that Yahweh made them to be healthy. And this is what they're groaning about right now. They're groaning, wanting to be delivered. Now we talked about this microbiome. Here's an article, and it says, most people think of bacteria within the body as a cause of getting sick or developing certain diseases. But did you know that at all times there are actually billions of beneficial bacteria present within all of us? In fact, bacteria make up our own microbiome, an integral internal ecosystem that benefits our gut health and the immune system. Recently, the scientific community has really come to embrace the important role that bacteria have in fostering a strong immune system and keeping us healthy. Not only are all bacteria not detrimental to our health, but some are actually crucial for boosting our immunity, keeping our digestive systems running smoothly, and our hormones level balanced, and our brains working properly. But what is the human microbiome? Each of us has an internal complex ecosystem of bacteria located within our bodies that we call the microbiome. The microbiome is defined as a community of microbes. The vast majority of the bacterial species that make up our microbe live in our digestional systems. This is why Yahweh said in the very beginning, guard the food supply, Adam. Don't let that falter. Don't let that become defiled. But it was. And so that affects everything. It affects the way that we think, the way that we act, and everything else. There are 10 to 100 trillion symbiotic microbial cells harbored in each person. And that's the bacteria in your gut. Our own individual microbiomes are sometimes called our genetic footprints, since they help determine our unique DNA. See, that's how special they are. Like this old saying goes, you are what you eat. There's some truth to that. Okay? And notice this is the bacteria that make up our microbiomes can be found everywhere, even outside our own bodies, on nearly every surface we touch, and every part of the environment that we come into contact with. We always state that, right? Do not touch the unclean, and I will receive you. See? So all of these things have come into play in Yahweh's laws. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing that Yahweh has said that it's amazing, okay? So let's jump down here to verse 87 and close. It says here, the microorganisms will get their health back. They'll come back healthy and alive. We'll get the rains, the former and the latter rains, and we'll get our land back to where you can plant a crop, and we'll know what we're going to get. We'll get a healthy crop from that healthy land, because we're going to restore these things that the earth, that right now Russia and all the other nations, are getting ready to destroy with their nuclear weapons. May Yahweh bless you, man.